Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're jumping right into the fascinating neuroscience behind two absolute breakthrough mental health molecules, MDMA and psilocybin. Now, if you've been tracking the clinical data lately, you've probably heard these two constantly mentioned in the same breath, right? Like they're just two flavors of the exact same revolutionary treatment. But today, we're going to break down the science of why they are absolutely not the same thing. We're talking fundamentally different tools built for fundamentally different jobs.
Look at this idea right here. One is about fear, the other is about meaning. I want to use this to instantly decouple these two treatments in your mind. Because think about it, trauma and depression, they aren't the same wound. So it makes total sense that they'd require completely different tools to heal. One does the heavy lifting by letting you confront profound fear, while the other heals by helping you find meaning when you're just completely stuck. Okay, let's dive into this. We'll start with the misconception of lumping them together. Then we'll hit the neuroscience, the therapy models, check the 2026 FDA scoreboard, compare the risks, and wrap up with access and finding the right fit.
Section 1. The misconception, lumping them together.
For decades, we've relied on traditional SSRIs and standard talk therapy. And look, they've helped some folks, but honestly, they've left a whole lot of people stranded without real relief. So when MDMA and psilocybin finally re-entered the clinic, it was super easy to just casually toss them both under this big umbrella of assisted therapy. But treating them like variations of the same thing is a huge mistake. They operate along entirely different fault lines in the brain. To get why, we really have to define MDMA accurately. It is an empathogen. It's not a classic psychedelic. It essentially forces serotonin out of neurons and triggers this massive surge of oxytocin. That brings us incredible warmth, trust, and most importantly, a dramatic drop in fear. But here's the absolute kicker. Unlike a classic psychedelic, when someone takes MDMA, their consciousness stays fully intact. You aren't tripping. The world just finally feels safe.
Section 2. The neuroscience, how they alter the brain.
Let's move from those high-level definitions down to the micro level, because watching how these molecules actually behave in the brain is fascinating. MDMA's main trick involves a serotonin transporter, or SERT. It actually slips inside the neuron, reverses the pump's direction, and just floods the synapse with serotonin. The therapeutic magic here is that this totally dampens the amygdala, your brain's fear center. It turns the fear volume way down, so a patient can actually safely approach a traumatic memory without panicking. Psilocybin, on the flip side, is a classic psychedelic. Once it metabolizes, it acts directly as a 5-HT2A serotonin receptor agonist. So it doesn't flood the synapse, it acts like a key turning on very specific receptors. This spikes neural entropy. It literally desynchronizes brain activity, flattening out those rigid habitual grooves and loosening up the default mode network. That's the specific circuit that drives that relentless self-referential rumination in severe depression. So one quiets fear, the other literally alters the structural flow of consciousness itself.
Section 3. Different therapies for different wounds. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the clinical approaches look so different.
Because these mechanisms are so distinct, the clinical protocols have to be distinct too. MDMA-assisted therapy is purpose-built from the ground up for PTSD. We're talking 2 or 3 highly structured dosing sessions, usually 80 to 125 milligrams, guided by 2 co-therapists. The molecule creates this safe container, a temporary window where fear vanishes, so the patient can actually face and reprocess specific traumas. Meanwhile, psilocybin therapy is geared toward treatment-resistant depression and existential distress. This is a full-day, deeply internal session, a 25 milligram dose, monitors in the room, curated music playing, and eye shades on. You aren't systematically dismantling a specific fear here. Instead, it sparks this broad, profound perceptual shift that can totally reframe deeply entrenched, hopeless mental loops.
So, the big question, do these targeted approaches actually work? Well, just look at this number. 71%. In the MAAP2 Phase 3 clinical trials, a staggering 71% of patients in the MDMA group literally no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. I mean, let that sink in for a second. 71% lost their PTSD diagnosis entirely, compared to 48% on the placebo. On paper, that is one of the strongest effect sizes we have ever seen in the history of PTSD pharmacotherapy.
Section 4. The 2026 FDA scoreboard.
Now, despite that massive historic efficacy for MDMA, the regulatory reality we are looking at in 2026 is a fascinating and frankly kind of frustrating paradox. Here's the timeline. Back in August 2024, the FDA issued a complete response letter. They essentially rejected MDMA despite those incredible trial numbers we just talked about. Their reasoning? They cited concerns over functional unblinding, basically meaning patients obviously knew they were on the drug, which they felt undermined the placebo, and they raised red flags about therapist conduct at some trial sites. So MDMA totally stalled out. Meanwhile, psilocybin has been advancing at lightning speed. The COMP005 trial succeeded in June 2025, and then COMP006 hit its primary endpoint with massive statistical significance in February 2026. Then, just 2 months later, in April 2026, we got Executive Order 1441. This directed federal agencies to accelerate access for psychedelics with completed Phase 3 trials, which basically handed psilocybin priority review vouchers, all while MDMA's eligibility is still heavily contested.
Section 5. Comparing the risks.
That complex regulatory landscape brings us to a super important piece of the puzzle: safety. Because you literally cannot categorize one of these as the safe one and the other as the dangerous one. Their hazard profiles pull in completely opposite directions. With MDMA, the sharpest risks are highly acute and physiological. It spikes your heart rate and body temperature, which brings risks of hyperthermia and hyponatremia, which is dangerously low blood sodium. But the biggest one? Combining MDMA with other serotonergic drugs, like everyday SSRIs or MAOIs, can trigger fatal serotonin syndrome. Psilocybin's risks, on the other hand, are almost entirely psychological. The classic hazard is a destabilizing bad trip. Physiologically, it's remarkably non-toxic, but it has rock-solid psychological contraindications. If someone has a personal or family history of bipolar disorder or psychosis, psilocybin can easily trigger prolonged manic or psychotic episodes. So again, it's not a hierarchy of danger, they're just completely different risk curves.
Section 6. Access and the right fit.
So what does this actually mean for someone seeking help today in 2026? We really have to look at the stark, practical asymmetries in how you can legally access these treatments right now. At the federal level, sure, both are still strictly locked down as Schedule I substances. But at the state level, totally different story. Psilocybin currently has fully licensed, supervised use pathways up and running in Oregon and Colorado, and New Mexico is busy building out a purely medical program slated for late 2026. MDMA, however, was explicitly left out of state frameworks like Colorado's natural medicine model. There are 0 state supervised access programs for it. If you aren't in a clinical trial, your only highly restricted routes are expanded access or compassionate use. Which means, incredibly, despite having stronger raw efficacy data for PTSD, MDMA is currently way harder to access legally than psilocybin.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly it summarizes everything we've just covered. MDMA is an empathogen. It reverses SERT to quiet the amygdala for PTSD. Right now, it's stalled by the FDA and carries heavy physiological risks. Psilocybin is a classic psychedelic. It acts as a 5-HT2A agonist to loosen the default mode network for depression. It's advancing rapidly with regulators, but brings very real acute psychological risks. They aren't rivals fighting for the same trophy. They are vastly different pharmacological tools.
Which leaves us with this final crucial question. How precisely can we match each to the person it was made for? Look, it is time we stop asking which molecule is better. Honestly, you wouldn't ask if a hammer is better than a screwdriver, right? You ask what you're trying to build or what you're trying to repair. We have an empathogen that quiets fear to heal trauma and a psychedelic that loosens rigidity to lift depression. 2 completely different keys cut for 2 completely different locks. The future of mental health doesn't depend on one winning out over the other. It depends entirely on whether our medical and regulatory systems can learn how to place the right key into the right lock. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and I'll see you in the next explainer.